Did you know that not everyone you interact with is real? What do I mean by this? Well, you may be interacting with someone that you think is a human made of flesh and blood, just like you and I. However, I'm going to share 3 stories with you where this wasn't the case. In 2013, I lost my mom to cancer, and somewhere in between that date and the time I tried to leave this place in 2014, I interacted with an individual that was not necessarily of the 3D. I went to a food court. I was looking for a table. There was absolutely nowhere to sit. It was extremely busy. And so I walked around, and eventually the only spot I found was this one seat that was at a table where there was a gentleman sitting. And I asked him, I'm like, "Excuse me, sir, there's nowhere to sit. Do you mind if I sit here?" And he's like, "Yeah, go ahead." And so I sat down, and this was an extremely large guy. Like, I'm 6'3", and this guy was, 6 foot plus and probably 300 pounds, right? And I was sitting there, and at the time, I didn't want to be here. I call it my walking zombie days. And I was just eating my food, right? And he asked me, he's like, "How's your day going?" And I just said, "Good." And as I was taking a bite, I looked up, and this guy had completely disappeared. And I stood up, because this just bamboozled me. I stood up, and I did a 360. I was looking around, and this guy was nowhere to be seen. He just disappeared. Another situation I had where individuals were not exactly of the 3D was a time in 2022 when I was hiking, and I was looking for waterfalls to take pictures of my sculpture. And I came across 2 individuals that I thought were dressed from like the 80s. Turns out they were from the 70s. They had like extremely old windbreakers on, and I came to this fork in the road, and this couple walked by me, and I was like, "Hey, do you guys know where the waterfall is?" And they pointed me in the wrong direction, to the left. And that's where I went and met this demonic psychopath that would end up putting arsenic in my drink. And I later found out from an Akashic Records reading that I had, because I got a really weird vibe from them. So I asked this woman, were they of the 3D? And it turned out that they had actually been murdered in the 70s and were just stuck in a loop, continuously walking there. But when I saw them, they appeared to be as real as you and I. Another situation that I had, perhaps my favorite, in 2015 I started working with this demonic witch that started sending me death spells that would eventually have her own son jump off a building. I went to her 1 year after attempting to leave this place, when Archangel Michael appeared and showed me that was no longer an option. So she started sending me all these spells to have me attempt that once again, and it was returned and made her own son jump off a building. So she decided to step it up by flying to the Philippines and working with dark practitioners. And one of the spells that she tried to conjure up was, me getting into a car accident, and she was working with this dark practitioner. And one day, I can't remember when this was, 2023, 2024, I was in Vancouver riding my bike around the seawall. And when I got back to my vehicle, I was putting my bike on the bike rack, and this Mercedes pulled up behind me, and this woman put her hand out the window and was just screaming frantically at me, right? So I go over, I'm like, "What's going on?" right? And she's like, "Can you help me? Can you help me? Can you help me?" And this woman had terror in her eyes like I never seen before, right? I'm like, "What's wrong? Calm down." She's like, "I need to get here." And she gave me this address, right? It was really strange. I never heard of it before. And I'm like, "What, you don't have a cell phone? You don't have Google Maps?" And she's like, "No, I'm not from around here. I'm not from around here." This woman was shaking with fear in her eyes, right? So I'm like, okay, I pull out my phone, I type in the address in Google Maps, and I look over at her, and she's just staring at me with terror in her eyes. And I'm like, "There's nothing coming up with this address, right?" She's like, "It's in North Van, it's in North Van." I'm like, "Well, I can type in North Van and get you to North Van, right?" And as I'm looking at my phone, I look over, and she's just staring at me, right? And she reached out and she touched my hand, and it was just ice cold, right? And eventually I was just like, "Hey, go turn up there, it'll take you to North Van." And she drove off, and I just had this extremely weird feeling. I was like, there's no way that woman was actually real. And I had an Akashic Records reading done where I found out that this was actually the dark practitioner that this demonic witch that I started working with in 2015 that's possessed by the Jezebel spirit was working with. And she had indeed had a return to sender. The accident she was trying to get me in is actually what took her out. And she was not of the 3D reality. So if you ever get a strange feeling in your gut from an interaction you have with someone that you think is of flesh and blood, just remember that that might not be the case.